Imagine working 2 jobs, missing dinner with your daughter 3 nights a week, giving your entire life to a company that doesn't even know your name. Now imagine the one man who actually saw you, the one man who treated you like a human being, was the billionaire who owned the entire building. This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of Adrian Knight and Emma Brooks, and what happened when a man worth $500 million chose to show up for work in a pair of worn-out boots. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the 14th of October, a quiet Monday morning that felt no different from any other, a black town car pulled up to a building on 5th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. The man who stepped out was not wearing a suit. He was not on his phone. He carried a battered canvas toolbox in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. His name was Adrian Knight, and he had just paid $470 million to purchase the Grand Monarch Hotel Group, one of the most recognized luxury hotel brands on the East Coast. But not a single person inside that building knew his face. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Adrian was 41 years old. He had built 3 companies from scratch, sold 2 of them, and turned the third into a real estate and hospitality empire that stretched across 6 states. His net worth had been written about in Forbes. His acquisition strategy had been taught in business school case studies. But if you passed him on the street that morning, in his faded gray work pants, his steel-toe boots, and a jacket with a small bleach stain on the left sleeve, you would not have given him a second glance. You might have held the elevator door. You might have nodded. But you would never have imagined that he owned the building. He had planned this for 11 months. And here is why. 22 years ago, Adrian's father, a man named Joseph Knight, worked as a janitor in a hotel not unlike the Grand Monarch. He worked nights 5 days a week for 18 years. He raised Adrian on that salary. He put food on the table, bought Christmas presents, and never once complained. But inside that building, he was invisible. Managers spoke over him. Executives walked past him without blinking. One afternoon, a vice president spilled a glass of water in the lobby and looked directly at Joseph and said, without a trace of apology, "You'll want to get that." Joseph cleaned it up without a word and went home that night and told his son, "Never trust a report written by managers, son. Trust what the cleaners see. They see everything." 3 years later, Joseph Knight died of a heart attack at 62. The hotel where he worked sent a card. It was addressed to the wrong name. That memory never left Adrian. And so before every major acquisition, he made himself a promise. He would spend at least 2 weeks on the ground floor before he ever walked into an executive meeting. He would learn what the cleaners saw. He arrived at the Grand Monarch that Monday as Daniel Webb, a new maintenance hire brought in through a temp staffing agency. He had an ID badge. He had a cover story. He had a locker in the basement. And within 6 hours, he had already begun to understand exactly what kind of place this was. The first time Adrian saw Emma Brooks, she was standing at the end of a hallway on the 14th floor, holding a scheduling clipboard, talking to one of the younger housekeeping staff with the kind of calm you only develop from years of absorbing pressure. Her name badge read Emma, housekeeping supervisor. She was 36 years old. She had dark hair pulled back neatly, kind eyes, and the particular expression of someone who was tired but refused to let it show. Adrian noticed that she laughed at something the younger woman said. Not a polite laugh, a real one, and then checked her clipboard again and went back to work. He did not speak to her that day. He spent most of that first afternoon replacing a faulty heating unit on the 3rd floor and listening. He listened to the way guests spoke to the staff. He listened to how managers addressed the cleaning crew when they thought no one important was watching. He noticed that the supply closets on floors 12 through 16 were perpetually understocked, despite invoices that claimed otherwise. He noticed that the overtime tracking sheets on the basement bulletin board had been corrected. Not updated, but corrected, in a different ink color than the original entries. He wrote nothing down. He had a memory that his college professors had called unsettling in its precision. It was on his second day that Emma spoke to him first. He had been assigned to fix a broken service elevator on the East Wing, a job that should have taken 40 minutes but had clearly been ignored for weeks. He was lying on his back underneath the control panel when he heard footsteps stop beside him. Pair of sensible black shoes. "You're the new maintenance guy," she said. It wasn't a question. "Daniel," he said, sitting up. "Emma," she replied. Then she looked at the elevator and looked at him. "They've been telling us that's getting fixed for 3 months." He said, "I'll have it done by end of shift." She tilted her head slightly, the way you do when you're deciding whether to believe someone. "Okay," she said, and she left. He had it done in 2 hours. The next morning, she stopped by the basement break room where he was eating a granola bar at a corner table. He had missed the morning food service because he had been dealing with a pipe fitting on the first floor since 6 a.m. She set a container of homemade pasta on the table beside him. "My daughter makes too much food," she said simply. Then she poured herself a coffee and sat 2 seats away and went over her clipboard. She did not make it a moment. She did not wait for him to say thank you in any particular way. It was the most natural act of generosity Adrian had encountered in years. He was, in that moment, completely disarmed. Think about that for a second. Here is a woman working 2 jobs, raising a child alone, managing a team of 20 housekeeping staff, running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and her first instinct when she sees someone sitting alone with nothing to eat is to share what she has. No calculation, no performance, just kindness. How many people do you know like that? How many times in your life has a stranger done something small for you that you've never forgotten? By the end of his first week, Adrian had developed a very clear picture of the Grand Monarch's internal culture. And it was not a beautiful one. The hotel's general manager was a woman named Vanessa Collins, 52 years old, impeccably dressed. The kind of person who remembered every guest's name and forgot every employee's face. She had managed the Grand Monarch for 9 years and in that time had cultivated a very specific hierarchy. One where the ballroom staff and guest relations team were treated as valued professionals, and the housekeeping, kitchen, and maintenance crews were treated as furniture. She spoke in the language of hospitality industry excellence. She had plaques on her office wall. She gave interviews to hotel management publications. And behind closed doors, she ran the building with a quiet, deliberate cruelty that had driven out 11 good employees in the past 18 months alone. Adrian found the exit interview records. He read every one. Her director of operations was a man named Brandon Hayes. He was 39, loud, and deeply insecure in the particular way that men who have spent their entire careers avoiding accountability tend to become. He had a gift for making humiliation sound like performance coaching. On Adrian's 4th day, he watched Brandon stop Emma in the middle of the lobby, in front of guests, in front of her team, and inform her that room 1104 had not been turned down to the standard expected of a 5-star property, as though Emma personally made the bed. He spoke loudly. He used the word unacceptable twice. Emma stood still, nodded, apologized on behalf of her team, and then turned and walked back to the elevators. She did not look angry. She looked like a woman who had been through this exact moment enough times that she had built walls specifically for it. That evening, Adrian found the inspection report for room 1104. The room had been turned down correctly. The complaint was fabricated. Ask yourself, have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do by someone who had the power to make it stick? Did you say anything? Or did you do what Emma did and absorb it because the cost of saying something felt too high? On the second Friday of Adrian's assignment, Emma's daughter Lily came to the hotel after school. This was not uncommon. Emma had a standing arrangement with the front desk manager, a quiet, decent man named Marcus, who let Lily sit in the small staff office near the lobby and do her homework until Emma's shift ended. Lily was 10 years old. She wore her school uniform and carried a backpack that was almost as big as she was, and she had her mother's eyes and her own very specific personality, which Adrian encountered when he came down the hall to replace a burned-out corridor light and found her sitting cross-legged on the floor outside the supply closet, sketching something in a notebook. "You're in my way," he said gently. She looked up. "You can step over me," she said, as though this were the most logical solution in the world. He laughed. She showed him what she was drawing, a building drawn in surprising detail for a 10-year-old. It had columns and an archway and what appeared to be a rooftop garden. "That's good," he said genuinely. "I want to be an architect," she told him. "Buildings should make people feel like they matter." He didn't have anything to say to that. He just looked at the drawing for a moment. She said, "Are you the one who fixed the elevator?" He said he was. She nodded approvingly. "My mom said someone actually fixed it." She didn't say it like it was normal. She said it like it was surprising. He said, "It shouldn't be surprising." Lily looked at him with the directness that only children and the very honest possess. "No," she said, "it shouldn't." He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about how much this child was watching, how much she was absorbing, how she was growing up in a world where a working elevator felt like an unexpected gift. He thought about what kind of man her father must have been, and then he remembered that Emma was widowed, and he felt the particular weight of that understanding settle in his chest. He did not ask Emma about it. He waited. He listened. By the end of his second week, the financial irregularities that Adrian had noticed in small pieces had begun to form a coherent and deeply troubling pattern. It started with the supply invoices. The Grand Monarch spent, on paper, roughly $60,000 a month on housekeeping and maintenance supplies, cleaning chemicals, linens, light fixtures, small appliance parts, and so on. But the physical inventory in the supply rooms told a different story. What was on the shelves was worth perhaps a third of what the invoices claimed had been delivered. Either the hotel was dramatically overpaying for dramatically underdelivered goods, or someone was submitting invoices for supplies that never arrived and pocketing the difference. Adrian pulled 3 months of receiving logs. He compared them to the invoice files, which he accessed through the maintenance department's shared drive, which nobody had thought to restrict because nobody had imagined that a maintenance worker would have any reason to look. The signatures on the receiving logs, the signatures confirming that goods had been delivered and accepted, belonged to 2 names that appeared on no other document in the system. 2 names that, when Adrian ran them through a quick search that evening on his personal phone, returned no results. They were invented. Someone had been signing for deliveries that never happened. Emma, it turned out, had noticed something similar nearly 2 years ago. She had not known what she was looking at. She was not a financial person, but she was meticulous and she was honest. And one afternoon she had been covering for an absent administrator and had noticed that a supply order she knew she had not approved had been marked as received on a date when the entire maintenance and housekeeping wing had been closed for a deep clean. She had made a copy of the relevant pages. She had kept them in an envelope in her locker because something in her gut told her they were important. She had never shown them to anyone. She had never known who to trust. In a building where speaking up got you publicly dressed down in the lobby in front of your team, silence felt like the only safe option. She told Adrian about this on a Thursday evening, outside on the hotel's service entrance steps, where they had both ended up taking a 10-minute break at the same time. It came out gradually, the way private things do between people who have been slowly building trust over shared lunches and quiet conversations and the kind of early morning small talk that happens when 2 people are consistently the first ones to arrive. She did not know why she told him. She said, "I don't know why I'm telling you this." He said, "Because you've been carrying it alone for too long." She looked at him for a moment in the way people look at you when you have accidentally said the true thing. Then she said, "I have those papers if they'd ever be useful to anyone." He said, "They will be." She said, "Do you know someone?" He said, "I might." She believed him. She didn't entirely know why, but she did. On a Tuesday morning in Adrian's 3rd week, he arrived at his locker to find a message from the HR coordinator asking him to report to Brandon Hayes' office immediately. He went. Brandon was standing behind his desk with his arms crossed and a security report on the desk in front of him. He told Adrian that a guest had reported a missing watch from room 802, a Rolex Submariner valued at $14,000, and that security footage showed Adrian in the hallway outside room 802 on the relevant evening. Adrian had been in that hallway. He had been replacing a light fitting 3 doors down. He said so. Brandon said the footage told a different story. A security guard escorted Adrian from the building within the hour. His ID badge was collected. He was told not to return to the property. His temp agency was called. He stood on the sidewalk on 5th Avenue in his maintenance jacket with his toolbox and his empty thermos and understood, with complete clarity, that the watch had not actually been stolen. It had been reported stolen. There was a difference. He called his private attorney from a coffee shop 2 blocks away. He also called a forensic accountant he had worked with before, a methodical and deeply discreet woman who operated out of a firm in Midtown. He told her what he had found and asked her to begin a formal review of the hotel's supply chain invoices dating back 4 years. Then he sat with his coffee and thought about Emma. Not about the investigation. About Emma. He thought about the way she had handed him that pasta container without making it into anything. He thought about what Lily had said about buildings that make people feel like they matter. He thought about what it must be like to go to work every day in a place that was designed, from its carpets to its crystal chandeliers, to communicate worth and beauty and excellence, and to be invisible inside it. He thought about his father. Meanwhile, back inside the Grand Monarch, Emma was the only employee who said, out loud to colleagues and to HR, that she did not believe the accusation against Daniel Webb. She had no evidence. She had only her knowledge of the person she had spent 3 weeks watching. She said, "In 3 weeks I have watched that man fix things that this building let break for years. He doesn't have a dishonest bone in his body." HR thanked her for her perspective. Nobody listened. She went back to work. But she thought about it all day. Have you ever stood up for someone when it would have been much easier and much safer to say nothing? How did that feel? And if you didn't, if there was a moment when you stayed quiet because the cost of speaking felt too high, do you still think about it? Adrian continued the investigation from outside the building. His attorney had quietly obtained subpoenas. The forensic accountant had begun mapping the invoice fraud and estimated, within the first 4 days of her work, that the scheme had been active for somewhere between 3 and 4 years and involved upward of $2.3 million in falsified supply invoices, diverted overtime pay, and vendor kickbacks. The money had moved through a shell company registered in Delaware under a name that traced back to Brandon Hayes' brother-in-law. Vanessa Collins had signed off on vendor approvals that gave the shell company preferred status. The paper trail was exhaustive and damning and, once assembled, was turned over to federal investigators who had, in fact, already been monitoring a related fraud in a different hospitality group and were very interested in what Adrian's team had found. During this period, Adrian and Emma met 3 times outside the hotel. Once for coffee, once at a diner where Emma had ordered soup and they had talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the hotel, about what her late husband, a teacher named Marcus Brooks, had been like, about how he used to read to Lily every night until she was 8 and refused further readings on the grounds that she was, in her words, fully literate now and he was wasting everyone's time, and about how Emma still put a book on his side of the bed. Sometimes and then moved it in the morning so Lily wouldn't see. Adrian told her about his father. He had not told anyone about his father in years. The 3rd time they met was at a park near Emma's apartment building, and Lily was there and she had her notebook and she showed Adrian a new drawing, a hotel this time but redesigned from the basement up with proper staff break rooms and natural light in the corridors and a rooftop that employees could access. "It's for the people who work there," she said. "Not just the guests." Adrian looked at the drawing for a long time. He looked at Emma. She was watching him with an expression that was soft and careful and just slightly afraid of itself. He understood that expression. He was wearing the same one. The Grand Monarch's annual shareholders gala was held on a Friday evening in the 3rd week of November. The hotel's grand ballroom was full. There were investors, executives, city officials, members of the press, and the senior management team. Vanessa Collins in a silver gown at the center of it all, preparing to receive a commendation for operational excellence from the Hotel Industry Association. The evening had been built around her. It was meant to be her night. The ballroom doors opened at 8:47 p.m. A man walked in. He was wearing a black tuxedo, custom-fitted, with a white shirt and no tie, just the collar button undone, the way someone wears a tuxedo when they are utterly comfortable in their own skin. He was carrying nothing. He moved through the room with a quietness that drew attention precisely because it contained no performance. The event's MC, a polished man from the Hotel Industry Association, looked at the back of the room and then at his notes, and then at the back of the room again, and then leaned to a colleague and said something. The colleague went pale. The MC approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I've just been informed that the new owner of the Grand Monarch Hotel Group is with us this evening." A pause. "Please welcome Mr. Adrian Knight." The room reacted the way rooms react when something happens that nobody was prepared for. Not loudly, but in layers, like a wave that starts at the back and moves forward in a ripple of whispers and turned heads and dropped conversations. At a table near the east wall, Emma Brooks was sitting with Marcus from the front desk and two other hotel colleagues who had been invited as part of a staff appreciation gesture that Vanessa had arranged specifically for the evening's optics. Emma had not wanted to come. She had borrowed a dress from her neighbor. She had sat through 40 minutes of speeches about brand standards and excellence metrics and had been thinking about whether Lily's school assignment on bridge engineering was due Thursday or Friday. And then she heard the name, and everything stopped. She turned. She looked at the man walking toward the center of the ballroom. The posture. The way he held his thermos, except he wasn't holding a thermos, he was holding nothing, but the posture was the same. The slight tilt of the head. The stillness. She pressed one hand flat against the table in front of her and felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when something true and enormous lands. He looked across the ballroom and found her face the way people find faces they have been looking for. He didn't smile right away. He just looked at her the way you look at someone when you want them to understand something before you have to say it. And then three things happened in quick succession. A federal investigator who had been positioned near the ballroom's east entrance moved to intercept Vanessa Collins, who had begun to edge toward the service exit with the particular studied casualness of someone who was trying very hard not to run. A second agent met Brandon Hayes at the bar, where he had been standing with a champagne glass and the expression of a man who was 3 seconds from understanding that his entire plan had just collapsed. And on the ballroom's main screen, the screen that had been displaying a slideshow of the hotel's properties and accolades, a document appeared. Then another. Supply invoices. Wire transfer records. The shell company registration. Employee overtime records with corrections in different ink. The forensic accountant had prepared the presentation. It was precise and it was devastating and it left no room for interpretation. Vanessa Collins was escorted from the ballroom by federal agents at 8:59 p.m. Brandon Hayes was detained at the bar. 2 other executives left in handcuffs before 9:15. The grand ballroom of the Grand Monarch Hotel was very, very quiet for a long moment after that. And then Adrian Knight walked to the microphone. He did not have notes. He stood at the microphone and looked out at a room full of investors and executives and press and hotel employees, and one woman near the east wall who was still pressing her hand flat against the table as though the floor had shifted. He said, 3 years ago, the man who taught me everything I know about this industry died in a hospital room in Queens. He spent 18 years working the night shift in a building very much like this one. His name was Joseph Knight. He swept floors and cleaned bathrooms and changed light bulbs, and nobody in that building ever asked him how he was doing. The night he died, the hotel sent a card addressed to the wrong name. He paused. I have spent the last 3 weeks in this building. Not in the executive suite. In the basement. I have changed light bulbs and replaced heating units and fixed an elevator that 3 separate work orders had been written for over the course of 4 months. I have eaten lunch in the break room. I have watched the people in this building, the real people in this building, do extraordinary work under conditions that were deliberately designed to make them feel small. Another pause. That ends tonight. He looked across the room. He looked at Emma. He said, "The people who make this hotel run are not invisible. They never were. We simply chose not to see them." He stepped back from the microphone. The room took a moment, and then someone began to clap. It was Marcus from the front desk. And then it was others. And then it was almost everyone. Emma was not clapping. She was sitting very still, and her eyes were full, and she was thinking about a container of pasta that she had set on a table beside a man she thought was a maintenance worker, and she was thinking about how he had looked at Lily's drawings, and she was thinking about every conversation they had ever had and trying to understand how all of it fit together into something that made sense. She was also thinking about how she was going to get through the next 10 minutes without crying in front of her colleagues. She did not speak to him that night. She took a car home, sat on the edge of Lily's bed and listened to her daughter breathe, and thought about things she could not yet put into words. He called her the following morning. She did not answer. He sent a message. It said, "I need you to know that the person you met was not a performance. Every conversation was real. I understand if you need time. I'm sorry I wasn't able to tell you sooner." She read it on her break, standing in the supply closet on floor 14, and she read it 3 more times. Then she called him back. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. She said, "I'm angry." He said, "You have every right to be." She said, "I made you pasta." He said quietly, "That pasta is why I'm certain you are the kindest person I have ever met." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You have to understand that I am a 40-year-old woman with a 10-year-old daughter and a mortgage and a very complicated life." He said, "I know." She said, "And you are a billionaire." He said, "I know that too." She said, "This is insane." He said, "It is completely insane." She laughed in spite of herself and then was quiet again. And then she said, "Tell me about your father." And he did. For a long time, in the months that followed, the Grand Monarch underwent a complete restructuring. A new general manager was brought in, a woman who had spent 15 years working her way up from the kitchen staff of a boutique hotel group in Chicago, and who ran her properties on the principle that the best indicator of guest experience was employee experience. A formal audit of all supply contracts was completed. 7 additional employees who had participated in the fraud were dismissed. 23 employees who had had their overtime pay unlawfully diverted were reimbursed in full, with interest, in a ceremony that Adrian attended and that made the local news not because of who Adrian was, but because of what was said. An overnight shift supervisor named George, who had worked in hotel maintenance for 29 years, received a check for $11,000 in stolen wages. And when a reporter asked him how he felt, he said, "Like someone finally read our names on the list." That line stayed with people. Emma was offered a newly created position, Director of Employee Experience, a role that was built around exactly the kind of work she had been doing informally for years. She said yes after 1 week of thinking about it. She also said yes to something else, several months later, in a quiet restaurant in the West Village, after Lily had spent 45 minutes interrogating Adrian about load-bearing walls and whether he thought glass facades were structurally overused. And he had answered every question with a seriousness she clearly respected, and Emma had watched the two of them across the table and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for 3 years. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and certain and real. Those are the best kinds of things. There is a version of this story where the lesson is about karma, about what happens to people who are cruel when the person they were cruel to turns out to be powerful. But that is not what this story is about. The people who mocked Adrian Knight in those hallways, who told him maintenance belonged in the basement, who fabricated a theft report to remove him from the building, they did not lose their careers because Adrian was a billionaire. They lost their careers because they had been stealing and lying and treating human beings as though their dignity was optional. Those things have consequences regardless of who is watching. The only difference is that this time, someone actually was. The real story here is Joseph Knight, who cleaned hotel floors for 18 years and told his son to trust what the cleaners see. It is Emma Brooks, who shared her food with a stranger because that is simply who she is. It is Lily, who draws buildings where the staff break rooms have windows. It is George, who worked 29 years in hotel maintenance and never stopped showing up. It is every single person who has ever done excellent, necessary, invisible work and wondered whether any of it mattered to anyone. It matters. It always mattered. The problem was never the workers. The problem was always the people who decided some human beings were worth less than others. That is a decision, and decisions can be changed. Tell us in the comments, if you were in Emma's position, would you have forgiven someone who hid something that big from you? And if you were Adrian, if you had grown up watching your father be invisible, would you have done what he did? We want to hear from you. And if this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you know, or a moment in your own life, share it with one person today who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply make sure the right person reads the right name on the list.